If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? The words of Hillel. The past year has been filled with the unimaginable. I have been shocked to my core by events personal and societal. As my body disappeared into the white tube of the MRI a year ago, so did the confidence that I was immune to the pace and cadence of the life I live. I learned the hard way. I did a wedding out of town, was a bit dizzy, and the next day I could not pick up a coffee cup with my left hand. The loss of control was scary, but not scary enough to say no to the funeral I was to officiate. The family had waited weeks. So I sat on a folding chair with a widow as we watched a loved one's remains buried. Then and only then did I drive to the hospital. I did not even cancel my dinner plans, thinking I was suffering from some inner ear issue. I never get sick. I learned that I'd had a stroke, and more worrisome was that it was not my first. Apparently, I had plowed through an earlier stroke, and luckily there were no or little physical effects. But still, there I was, pushing to get out, to get back to the routine that gave birth to my stroke, until my daughter Eve said, "You're taking some time off, or I'll never forgive you." To align our physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being, to be right with ourselves before we can be right for others, that is the goal of these holy days. To take stock of who we are and who we need to be, both as individuals and as members of a sacred community. We have to learn that care for the self is not a frivolous luxury. I had to learn that rest and exercise and feeding my soul were as necessary as eating, drinking, or breathing. And I feel blessed in my return to health. In my effort to feed my soul over these last 4 years, I studied Jewish texts at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where I earned the title of a rabbinic fellow. I became interested in the stories of the sages who passed on to us wisdom. I especially have come to love the life story of Hillel. Born in Babylonia, moved to Israel, he was a very, very poor man, not part of the aristocratic rabbinic line, and yet he wanted more than anything to be a scholar. He does not know an aleph from a bet at age 40, and yet he becomes the greatest scholar of his time. The responses in the Talmud are divided between only two schools, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And one of Hillel's axioms is what I would like to focus on this evening. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? This is so important. Thomas More, in his book, Care for the Soul, warned us we do not know how to feed our souls. He writes, this is the goal of the soul path, to feel existence, not to overcome life's struggles and anxieties, but to know life firsthand, to exist fully in context. And Sigmund Freud called work and love the parents of human civilization. But in our day, it's work, not love, that appears to be our chiefest joy. Economists tell us that in the last 2 decades, the average worker has added an extra 164 hours, a month of work to the work year. Vacations have shortened by 14%, and parental time available to children per week has fallen by 10 hours. Studies show that once our basic need for food and shelter and attachment are met, happiness is dependent on a loving family, good friends, good health, meaningful work, involvement in a larger community, and spiritual expression. In other words, higher income and what it buys turns out to be pretty much absent as a contributing factor in human happiness. Please do not mention this to the compensation committee of the congregation. Maimonides points out that what is necessary for life, air and water, comes cheaply, while that which is unnecessary, such as rubies and emeralds, comes quite dearly. So that when one spends energy and resources endeavoring to seek what is unnecessary, it becomes difficult to find what is necessary. This is the question of these holy days. What is necessary at this moment in time to be whole and to safeguard our souls? There is no moment, we are told, in Judaism, which Judaism does not ask us to bless and to be intentional about its opportunity. My grandfather, my father's father, taught me a love for books, debate, and good conversation. But most, he always reminded me that what set us apart as Jews was our toast, l'chaim, to life. In the face of everything that history has thrown at us, we lift our glasses in toast to life. In the fractured world we live in, we cannot afford to ignore the beauty of life. This year, with all we have faced, it is more important to vigorously embrace our Judaism. We will give you ample opportunity this year to deepen your spiritual hold on life, to enjoy and engage. In fact, Rabbi Shankman tomorrow will share new paths for more spiritual life. But this is not only for yourself, but rather, as Hillel said, if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? We learn that when you deepen your spiritual hold on life, you are led to a deeper understanding of what it means to engage with others. So how do we engage with others? The human world is today, as never before, split into two camps, each of which understands the other as the embodiment of falsehood and itself as the embodiment of truth. Each side has assumed a monopoly of the sunlight and has plunged its antagonist into night. Each side demands that you decide between day and night. Does this not sound like a description of the combative rhetoric between presidential candidates or among Jews of different points on the religious or political spectrum? In fact, this description of polarized debate, as contemporary as it is classic, was written in 1967 by philosopher Martin Buber, and the words are as relevant today as they were in 1967. You are aware of the litany of horrible, violent attacks that have occurred in the United States and worldwide. In the last several years, each attack bearing the hallmark of race or religious hatred. Each attack becomes familiar by the shorthand for where it takes place: Charleston, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Christchurch, Poway. And we become somewhat complacent after the first horrors subside. Each of these has one thing in common. They take place in a world where there is a lack of responsibility about our words. It is our responsibility as Reformed Jews to decide how to respond and not to be silent. And because in the larger context of hatred and violence, our silence has been deafening. Ignoring Hillel's dictum over the last 19 years, we as American Jews have been only for ourselves if we have largely ignored the reality of anti-Semitism and violent hatred that has plagued European Jewish communities. Today, Jews are reluctant to wear kippah publicly in France or in Germany for fear it will lead to violence. What was across the seas or seemed to be excused as anti-Zionist, anti-Israel sentiment was not our problem. The anti-Semitic tropes we heard from the political left in Britain's parliament was excused as crude and non-democratic. But now we have had months of near unanswered anti-Semitic tropes from the left and the right in this country, from the President of the United States and from members of Congress as well. We as a Jewish community have been impotent in our response, defending desperately our own political alliances while sacrificing the Jewish community in the process, letting support for Israel become weaponized and the use of anti-Semitic tropes normalized. While in general, these acts of horrific violence are arguably the works of madmen, the underlying hostility permeates our civil society, spilling out into our everyday interactions. We've allowed ourselves to become a society in which there are those among us who simply choose not to listen to ideas that make us uncomfortable. There are those who ignore others, who give voice to beliefs which differ from their own. There are those whose prime method of communication is to stifle or to intimidate, to bully or to belittle, to demonize or to moralize, to squelch or to censor. Those individuals whose thoughts and opinions compete against their own. And this intolerance has been spread to the internal workings of our community, the larger Jewish community, so alive with history, sacred tradition, and hope for our children, has been challenged in unexpected ways. Zionism, Israel, American Jewry, and world Jewry are not only under attack from outside forces, but whether we read left to right or right to left, we have left hating right and right hating left. Jews attacking other Jews. An 8-year-old girl was spat on for walking on the men's side of the street in Beit Shemesh. Women have been arrested at the wall for the crime of wearing a talit or for carrying the Torah to the wall with intent to read. Have we forgotten that before Yigal Amir took the life of Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's greatest lover of peace, a group of Orthodox rabbis had decreed that assassination was acceptable? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Hessel once said, "Speech has a power. Words do not fade. What starts out as sound ends in deed." And we who have lived through book burnings and bannings, we who have seen words of hate turn to acts of terror, are guilty ourselves of squelching discussion and diversity. We live in difficult times, and I'm very afraid that this election cycle will be even more divisive for the American Jewish community. We need civility, clarity, and the opportunity to think through our reaction and response to such anti-Semitism. My mentor, Jacob Rader Marcus, was not always the premier American Jewish historian he became. He only became that as a result of an incorrect prediction he wrote in the late 1930s. That German democratic society would never turn on its Jews. This was why Marcus turned to studying the new promised land, America. But 75 years later, our actions will determine whether America is the new promised land that is a safe harbor for all, or if the 75 years was an anomaly in history for American Jews. Barry Weiss, a daughter of the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue, and the New York Times reporter, has written a powerful personal book called How to Fight Anti-Semitism. What she points out is that it is a fight not only for the safety and continuity of Judaism in America, but the very health and well-being of American society and what this nation has stood for from its inception. She writes of the new anti-Semitism, "There's a lot of misunderstanding that is just prejudice against Jews. And yes, it can manifest itself as that. But it's really a signal of a society that has replaced lies for truth. And open societies are dead or dying. This is an early warning signal," she says. Weiss takes a very Jewish approach. We should not talk, but we should act. She writes, "You have two choices confronting anti-Semitism. One is to avoid the topic completely. The other is to tell the truth. And the Jewish people have always been a contentious people. I don't think we should be scared about it." I agree with Barry Weiss's approach. We should tell the truth and we should act. Now more than ever, we need to respond with action. Therefore, as I've done before, I'm calling the congregation into conversation. We will be exploring the topic of anti-Semitism, beginning with my Yom Kippur study session tomorrow with an esteemed panel. Then Deborah Lipstadt, renowned scholar and author, of the new book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, will formally open the Congregational Conversation at Temple on Wednesday, October 23rd. We will discuss her book in monthly conversation throughout the fall and winter before Professor Lipstadt returns for a concluding lecture on February 12th. It is my hope to engage some of our interfaith partners in this conversation as well. In addition, last spring, I tasked our senior educators to launch a new initiative, a program to make our WHC students certifiably ready. Ready means reform, engaged, articulate, determined youth. This program promised to prepare our kids for the reality of high school and college campuses, to help them know how to stand up for what they believe, teaching them to call out hate and not allowing themselves or their Judaism to be defined by others. They will know that righteousness as a Reformed Jew is, as expressed by Hillel, particularism that leads to universalism. We stand against all hate, and we stand up for justice and equality for all. Further, we need to draw on more than a century of interfaith innovations in this, our nation's capital. Our MLK celebration, our Freedom Seder, our Unity Walk, our joint Kristallnacht commemorations. As we engage with churches and mosques, all of these relations have to be the foundation for greater understanding and demanding that as a united religious and moral community, we give no tolerance to intolerance. On the world stage, last year in February, Pope Francis, representing 1.2 billion Catholics, and the Grand Imam, Dr. Ahmed Tayeb, representing 2 billion Muslims, met in the United Arab Emirates. They signed a historic document, the document of human fraternity, calling for world peace and for our seeking harmony and living together. It recognizes we're all part of one human family and calls for an end to violence, hatred, and religious discrimination, as well to address poverty and the care for our common home, the earth. It is an important and comprehensive document. On September 11th of this year, in memory of the terrorist attacks of that day, the High Committee of Human Fraternity document met at the Vatican with Pope Francis. These are world religious leaders handpicked by the Pope and the Grand Imam to bring into fruition the aspirations of the Human Fraternity document. On that day, they decided they would pick a Jewish representative. On that day, my Oma, who taught me to never back down in the face of hatred, would have been proud. On that day, that raised patch on my grandparents' dining room table where my grandfather would reach and touch as he led the Passover Seder, the very place where his own mother was killed with an axe, would seem a little smoother. On that day, my 90-year-old mother said, "This is good." On that day, the committee called and asked me to be the sole Jewish representative. I was privileged. I just returned from Rome on Sunday. A first-generation child of a Holocaust survivor, and I had audience with Pope Francis. My message to these world leaders was we must raise our voice to end all hate speech. Peace cannot be fostered in a world that does not fight anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all forms of religious bigotry. We cannot allow such degradation of the human family. My message was simple. If not now, when? Last, we must, as Barry says, as Barry Weiss teaches, lean into our Judaism. We must not allow the threats of violence to make us afraid to live our lives as Jews. When marching men with tiki torches chant, "Jews will not replace us," emulating the Nazi gatherings of the 1930s, they seek to intimidate us as Jews. We need to show all that we believe in faith over fear. The AJC, the American Jewish Committee, has designated October 25th, the Shabbat closest to the Pittsburgh murders, as Show Up Shabbat. I'm designating this year is Show Up Shana, Show Up Year. We must be stronger than ever in our social justice, in our worship, in our holiday celebrations, in our education endeavors for youth and adults alike. If we do not, and if we continue to allow the political climate to divide the Jewish community, it will not only be American Judaism that will suffer, but America will suffer. We must show our resolve. Perhaps then we'll be able to see reflected again in our lives not new words, but perhaps forgotten words. The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. These words were written by our first president, George Washington, in 1790. And the sentiment was etched in the world's heart again during World War II, a true story, one I love, where hate backfired and dignity won the day. Rabbi Roland B. Gittleson was the first Jewish chaplain in the American Marine Corps. At Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, there were approximately 1,500 Jewish Marines. Rabbi Gittleson was in the thick of the fray, ministering to Marines of all faiths. He shared the fear, horror, and the despair of the fighting men. His tireless efforts to comfort the wounded and encourage the fearful won him 3 service ribbons. When the fighting was over, the division chaplain, a Protestant minister, asked Rabbi Gittleson to deliver the memorial sermon at a combined religious service. The pastor wanted the fallen Marines honored in a single non-denominational ceremony. Unfortunately, racial and religious prejudice was strong in the Marine Corps, as it was throughout America. The majority of the Christian chaplains objected to having a rabbi preach over predominantly Christian graves. And the Catholic chaplains opposed any form of joint religious service. To his credit, the division chaplain refused to alter his plans. Gittleson, a believer in peace, wanted to save his friend's embarrassment, and so decided not to insist. Instead, 3 separate religious services were held. At the Jewish service, the congregation of about 70 or so who attended, Rabbi Gittleson delivered the powerful eulogy he originally wrote for the combined service. On March 3rd, 1945, he writes, and he delivered as such, "Here lie men who loved America because their ancestors generations ago helped in her founding, and other men who loved her with equal compassion because they themselves or their own fathers escaped from oppression to her blessed shore. Here lie officers and men, Negroes and whites, rich men and poor. Together here are Protestants, Catholics, and Jews together. Here no man prefers another because of his faith or despises him because of his color. Among these men there is no discrimination, no prejudice, no hatred. Theirs is the highest and purest democracy. Whoever so of us lifts his hand in hate against a brother, or who thinks himself superior to those who happen to be in the minority, makes of this ceremony and bloody sacrifice it commemorates an empty, hollow mockery. To this then, as our solemn sacred duty, we, the living, now dedicate ourselves to the right of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, of white men and Negroes alike, to enjoy the democracy for which all of them here have paid the price. Out of this, we promise the birth of a new freedom for the sons of men everywhere." Rabbi Gittleson's word and approach to the situation are instructive, and should be noted that the attempt to shut him down backfired. Word spread of this powerful speech, and they appeared on the front pages of the New York Times, and they were read into the congressional record, touching more lives than could have ever been imagined. We're all created in the image of God, members of one human family. May we have the courage to speak words of truth. May we have the compassion to hear even the truths that don't align with our own. Baruch Shamar v'haya ha'olam, God spoke and there was a world. How we speak to each other will determine the quality of our world. If we speak with respect and tolerance, we will build a world as Buber envisioned, where we are all lifted out of the darkness into the sunlight and able to see that we're all God's children. To do this, we have to open our eyes. And how to do this, I would like to share a meditation from the Reformed Prayer Book of Great Britain called To Open Eyes. To open eyes when others close them, to hear when others do not wish to listen, to look when others turn away, to seek to understand when others give up, to arouse oneself when others accept, to continue the struggle even when one is not the strongest, to cry out when others keep silent. To be a Jew, it is that. It is first of all that, and further, to live when others are dead, to remember when others have forgotten. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Ken Yehi Ratzon.